So we're covering now for the first time Aerosmith. This is their 1976 album Rocks. On Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, it comes in at number 203, number 14 in 1976, number 925 of all time. It's Aerosmith's second highest rated album. It's behind 1975's Toys in the Attic. And on Rolling Stone's list, it comes in at number 366.
Okay, now before we go to Josh, Matt, can you add some context right here? Because a long-standing discussion that you and I have had has been your historic thoughts on Aerosmith and then a counter-narrative that I have. So without giving away anything of your take, could you summarize for the listeners a little bit of that narrative that we've carried? And this is sort of the final proving ground of that today, I feel like.
My narrative with Aerosmith has been that I've always felt that they were an overrated blues rock band, and I know a lot of people love them, and I never did. I did like some singles. I do have an album. I did get one or two albums of theirs, so like they had moments that I liked, but I always thought they were overrated, and I really disliked Steven Tyler, just her whole persona. So it hasn't been positive. And then John would retort saying 70s Aerosmith is different than 80s and 90s Aerosmith, which I always knew, but I probably was always more familiar with the stuff in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, so this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Matt's going to be our last take on this by design because I want to kind of see where we're at there. Josh, who I have no idea what his thoughts are on Aerosmith, is going to start us off. Wild card. Go ahead, Josh.
So I didn't really have any relationship to Aerosmith beyond kind of their 90s sound and, you know, this theme song from Armageddon and maybe Liv Tyler to a certain extent. And maybe knowing Dream On from Dazed and Confused, I think. So
would we call Liv Tyler low-key smoke show or high-key smoke show?
I mean, she's pretty beautiful.
I say high-key smoke show.
Yeah. I wouldn't say she's like some sort of hidden gem or something.
Yeah, no, I did.
Dream On was not from Dazed and Confused. That was Sweet Emotion.
Okay, so yep. All right,
Dream On's just was their probably, I think that was their first hit, and that's been in a variety.
First album, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, little to no relationship. I wasn't like a huge fan of them in the 90s. I didn't see them on tour or anything like that. And so, you know, I'm right between you guys in terms of, well, John always said that 70s Aerosmith is different than 90s Aerosmith. And after listening to this album, I like them. I'm pretty impressed. I'm not like blown away, but they definitely are, first of all, harder than I would imagine they would have been. They almost go into like metal territory at times in terms of like the speed of their guitars and some of kind of the pounding drums and things like that. So I really appreciated that. They don't shy away. I mean, for this time period, there has not been much that's as fast and as hard as what we've heard on this Aerosmith album, in my opinion. So that was a pleasant surprise. You can still tell it's Steven Tyler's voice, but it's a more youthful, stronger voice. So, and it's not as raspy or screaming, if that makes sense. So I like that too. It still holds to kind of the Aerosmith template of like almost call and response in some ways, or call and response with like a guitar. Like he'll say something and then the guitar will answer, and that kind of comes throughout the album. I like they don't really hesitate to go instrumental on like a lot of their songs at the end. They kind of do their lyrics and stuff, and then they like finish out with like an instrumental track or like a guitar solo and stuff. So that's kind of different too, or almost like in a proggy way, but they're not shy about like showing off their musical chops in that respect. I like the guitar work on Aerosmith on this album. They do a good job. They bring good energy to the album as well. Back in the Saddle, which is the opening track, it really gets you amped up right from the get-go, and you can hear that Aerosmith sound if you're at all familiar with any of their songs. And that's exemplified here, and I think that carries through to the 90s as well. I feel like I don't know what happened to them in the 80s. I'm sure they were still producing music, but it's almost in my mind right now I have like 70s Aerosmith, and then there's like a big gap, and then there's 90s Aerosmith, and I don't think that's the case, but that's
there's an 80s comeback period in between,
Okay.
which is like there's 70s Aerosmith and then a long period of time where the band dissolves due to drugs. And then there's like we randomly show up on MTV in like 1985 after making our last album, I think in like 79.
Okay.
Period Aerosmith. And so
I think
like,
Run DMC had something to do with that resurgence.
Oh, right.
it did, and also the fact that they were able to do really like striking videos, like not just Walk This Way, but also like Dude Looks Like a Lady and like Love in an Elevator, you know, that are Ragdoll, right? Those were all like big, like over the top, like they
ate up
created
that
the 80s
MTV spotlight. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, they kind of were able to kind of like we talked about Heart, right? Where like Heart sexed themselves up in the 80s and became a different band altogether pretty much. Like Aerosmith sort of did the same thing. They had like a 70s Aerosmith, and then there was like this 80s version of Aerosmith. So, yeah. And then of course that became a 90s Aerosmith, which was a whole different thing. So
I imagine, you know, listening to this album that I'm intrigued by Aerosmith. I want to see if they kind of branch out or if they always sound the same in terms of guitar and sound, because it's always Steven Tyler and the guitars for the most part. I didn't pick up on a lot of drum work or bass in the same way that we kind of hear those things in other bands more. I feel like Steven Tyler's front and center, although at times too it feels like the vocals are matched with the guitars in terms of volume on this album. I don't know if that's a production thing or intentional or what, but I did notice that this time. So yeah, it was pleasant. I kind of group this almost in the same group with like Kiss in terms of like 70s rock, quote unquote, like almost like entry level, accessible, fun rock and roll without being too experimental or out there. What about you, John?
Well, so a couple of things. Like to me, 70s Aerosmith is a heavier, harder version of it. They play, I don't even know if you guys know what this is, but you'll probably just know because of the words. It's called blues, B-L-O-O-Z-E. It's like a white person American blues, right? And it's like, it's kind of like the Rolling Stones, but if you just amped it up even more, like just a bluesed up, you know, like raw, sexed up blues. I mean, and the first thing you notice on this album is that the guitar work is right up in front. Like Joe Perry and also Bradley Whitford, I think is the name of Brad Whitford, I think is the name of the other guitarist for Aerosmith. They're all over this album. Steven Tyler, like this is the album where Steven Tyler becomes like the all sex, you know, front man that you think of in like later things. Like before that, he was writing, you know, Toys in the Attic and like Dream On and Mamakin, right? Which are these songs about all different, like this album, I mean, is all sex all the time pretty much. Like, you know, this is a rock and roll lifestyle album. I mean, Lickin' a Promise and Sick as a Dog. These are not Back in the Saddle. These are not ambiguous as to like what they're writing about here. I've also always found it interesting, like how many people love this album. Because I know, to me, Toys in the Attic and Rocks are basically a paired album set. They're Aerosmith's two best albums, and they're like very close to each other. Toys in the Attic's first, then Rocks is second. Rocks is a little harder. Toys in the Attic has more hits, I think. But like this album, like off the top of my head, like knowing this, I remember seeing a rockumentary on this. This is like one of Slash's favorite albums, if not his favorite album, I think. I'm pretty sure he said it's the one that made him want to do guitar. Like, I mean, he loves it. Another guy who loves this album is James Hetfield. Like, Back in the Saddle, I think, is like one of his favorite songs ever. And I also learned from Montage of Heck that Kurt Cobain loved this album, which I always thought was really interesting too, and listened to it a bunch. So this is a well-regarded album by musicians. I really like this album. Some of the songs go a little long with the blues, BLOOZE, sort of like long play,
right.
And stuff like that. And every once in a while, I'm like, we don't need to kind of go, one more, run around on some of this stuff.
Right.
You know what immediately stood out to me to the point where I actually looked it up and people did mention it? They played some jangle guitar on this album, which I hadn't really noticed before. And actually, I was curious about it. And one of the members of AEROSMITH, Tom Hamilton, the bassist, actually said, I'm a big Byrds fan. And I started to do some parts that were like this. And I'm like, wow, it's really one of those interesting things that the more albums we listen to in context, the more
coming back.
I see bits and pieces of stuff that I would have never gotten if we hadn't seen it in the chronology. But yeah, this is like your quintessential Aerosmith album because it's still the Aerosmith that has edge, which is the Aerosmith I like, but it's also all the sexed bluesed up Aerosmith that like came later with hooks and stuff too. It's like it's the middle point to me of like the Aerosmith that I thought was a more credible rock band mixed with the commercial parts that I think made Aerosmith an enduring rock band. And that's probably how I would describe this album. It's not one of my favorite albums of the 70s, but it is an album I really enjoy from the 70s. And that's how I would describe this album. I can talk more, but I think we've set the stage nicely. Matt, what are your thoughts?
So I did know a couple of songs on here. I do have one of the albums I do have from Aerosmith. I have their original Greatest Hits album, which is a lot of the 70s stuff. I think I got it because it was in a bargain bin, like the Wiz or something was going out of business.
Nobody
and they're
beats
like,
the
oh,
Wiz.
50 cent albums or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I always like Dream On, So
let's not get rich or die trying. I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Exactly. So I did know those two songs, and I do like this album. I knew I would like this more than the other stuff. I'll have to say though too, like if I'm being totally honest, like there's a lot of the hits that Aerosmith did have in the 80s and 90s. There's a number of songs in there that I do like. My biggest issue, Steven Tyler is just one of those guys that annoys the hell out of me. Like, and and that persona that you're talking about from the 80s and 90s, where he just sucked up never met a camera he didn't like, was always out front talking to like the bravado, just thought he was the most amazing person ever, like the arrogance, and I know there's a lot of other artists that are like that, and some of them I like fine. It's just Steven Tyler's just rubbed me the wrong way, and I always found it weird. I knew this album was a lot about sex. It's just weird to me that like this is what I'm just gonna write all about sex, and it's like I don't know. I kind of roll my eyes at artists that do that. It's like that's your main kind of focal point. Even though I'm not the lyrics guy, it's just like, all right, we get it. You bang a lot of chicks, like that's all you're in it for. So
yeah,
good for you, man. Like, so what takeaways from this record? Definitely heavier than some of the other stuff. The guitar work, like you guys said, is really good. It's a full guitar sound. That's the word that I would use to describe. They really do put them up front, and you could tell that that both Perry and Brad Whitford, right? You said that's it. It's always Joe Perry, Steven Tyler, and the other guys, right? Like the other three guys that stand there. And I remember growing up, like watching them in videos, just going, "These guys are rock stars." They don't.
Well, and that's what it is.
Like that,
It's important to note, though, sonically they're not the other guys. It's just image-wise. Joe Perry and Steven Tyler, especially the '80s version of them, was totally built around those two being the iconoclasts, and the other three guys looking oddly their age, while the other two tried to look another age. But like, I want to mention that sonically, it's not like the bass lines and the other guitar parts are not as important as the other contributions, because they are. Yeah.
No, I'd agree with that. So it's like I'm getting, there was some Zeppelin hit, like Nobody's Fault reminded me of a Zeppelin type sound. That to me was them trying to do Zeppelin. And it was really good guitar solos. It's a rawer Aerosmith. This is more of a raw album. And I'm seeing the groundwork. When you mentioned Slash, that totally makes sense, because my other takeaway here is this is Guns N' Roses. This is this is where Guns N' Roses kind of like
I mean, shit, they covered Mamakin on the
yeah.
the spaghetti incident.
Yeah,
And
but
Rats in the Cellar sounds like hair metal all over the place.
Yeah, there's hair metal elements here. Guns N' Roses, I always kind of felt like they're not really hair metal. They're kind of in that, they get lumped in there, but they were kind of their own thing. But you could tell the influence on them, and that's I do love Guns N' Roses. And so I was hearing some of that here with the heavy and the full guitar sounds, and it's like a dirtier rock and roll blues band. You know, that's another sound. It's I was getting a little southern rock in here as well. You know, so and John, you mentioned kind of they go a little bit long into the solos and the jams. I actually kind of like that. That was one of my favorite parts of the record. I liked it because it's a good band. Like, you know, take nothing away from the musicianship here. They're tight and they play really well. And I find myself liking the parts where they go into those longer jams. I like the harmonica solos. That was they pepper that in here and there, which is kind of cool. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned those songs like "Sick as a Dog," "Lickin' a Promise." Those are some of my favorite songs on here. There was another.
Nobody's Fault is awesome too. It's super heavy.
No, yeah, that was the one that I felt was like kind of like a Zeppelin type song. Rats in the Cellars are great. The fast pace, you know, good. Yeah. They got good riffs, you know. And
also clearly a callback. Yeah, also clearly a callback to "Toys in the Attic." Rats in the Cellar.
Rats in the Cellar, Toys in the Attic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are all the hardest songs too on this album, I think.
Yeah, and I like those. You know, Last Child's kind of funky. You know, it's like got like more of a staccato kind of a thing. So they mix up the sounds a little bit. I like this, you know, and I think on further reflection, you know, we talk about there's some songs that I think from the 80s and 90s Aerosmith that I think that are fantastic songs. It's just. What really bothers me is like Steven Tyler bothers me, and I never got so into Aerosmith. So anytime I met somebody that was super into them, that would talk about how they're one of the greatest rock bands ever, it was one of that contrarian in me was like, no way, like, you know. So that's part of it too. But Aerosmith to me is kind of generally like a singles kind of band. So you know, from the 80s and 90s, I don't know that I did have. Get a Grip from the 90s, and that's a long album, and the singles on that are pretty good, and there's a lot of crap on it, you know. So when I got that album, that was also kind of like a nail in the coffin as far as like my feelings on Aerosmith, because I was like, God, yeah, they got some singles in there, but there's a lot of crap. And that's actually kind of how I felt. You know, you mentioned hair metal, Josh. That's kind of how I feel about hair metal as well. There's lots of good singles and stuff that I really like, and then if you buy an album, it's just got so much crap in it that it just makes you go, this isn't that good of a band. Like, they can do something. Don't get me wrong, it's got to be really hard to do, you know, some great singles, and let alone multiple ones, right? But there's tons of filler on albums, and that's, you know, I grew to really love the concept of the album and just really good albums, and you know, there was too much crap in there. But having said all that, this is a solid record from top to bottom. I could see why it's so popular. It didn't surprise me. I knew that it was going to be more like this. And like I said, it laid the foundation for, you know, laying the foundation for one of my favorite bands in Guns N' Roses. So props to them for that. So this is a thumbs up for me.
That's why Guns N' Roses is a cut above too, because all their songs are good. There's no filler.
Their albums
on that album.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say
that. I'll vouch for. There's plenty of bloat on some of the other ones, but
but I love that bloat too. That's my own. Yeah. Except My World, I can do without that.
Two things I'd like to add right here. One is that I can't think of Aerosmith to some degree without a infamous scene that a couple of the listeners of the show regularly will know of, a band from my high school covering Aerosmith at a bonfire and attempting to do the Steven Tyler like acceleration on Dream On, which is not on this album, by the way. But really let me know how much Steven Tyler's pipes are kind of ridiculous when he was in prime form before like drugs kind of, you know, blew it out a little bit. Because if you ever try to sing the Dream On part at the end where like he gets almost like, I'm not even gonna try it, but you know, the more like the Dream On, you know, where he goes like real feral almost. Like even if you warm up your voice and stuff, the level of difficulty to sing that is off the charts. And I will always remember this poor I remember thinking to myself, why would you ever pick that song to sing? Like the degree of difficulty is like 100, you know? And so that one always comes to mind. The other thing that I thought was hilarious is I don't look up anything on these albums until we cover them, but then I'll sometimes pull up All Music or Wikipedia just to like look at stuff as we're talking at the end, you know, just to see if I can add some tidbits.
Yeah.
And my favorite thing is I clicked on Back in the Saddle, which, by the way, a lot of the artists that I mentioned that I remember liking this album, it's like literally the who's who on the Wikipedia page of like, this person likes it. And I was like, okay, I'm not going nuts. The other thing that is the last thing of it is the saddle, in quotation marks, that Tyler refers to in the song is metaphorical to several sexual positions. So in case you're wondering, it's such
Deep
a
lyrics.
hilarious, it's a sentence all by itself. Like it's its own paragraph. And so it just made me laugh. I think it's funny that it's metaphorical to several, not just one, you know? So it made me laugh, but yeah.
Steven Tyler needs variety in his sexual position.
The concept of the song was cowboys and sex is another line that made me laugh from this. So yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, I enjoyed this hard rockin' album. I definitely like 70s Aerosmith more than I like some other 70s bands that get love from people like the Eagles and stuff. Like I will defend 70s
I'd agree
Aerosmith
with that.
as being a worthy 70s American rock band. And some will say the American rock band of the 70s. You know, that's a conversation well, it's the Eagles probably, and then in terms of like harder rock bands, right? By the Eagles, and I guess a band we're going to talk about later, Kiss, and we could talk about it there, right?
Can the Eagles are a harder rock band? I don't think that
All right.
can say that.
So I guess it's them or Kiss, and we're doing
I'm just
both
trying.
this, right?
I'm trying to think. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to think more about that. But
unless you count like Van Halen later, but that's like later, you know. So
yeah,
But that first
I
album.
mean they're in the
78,
'70s, so
right? Yeah.
78.